For better or worse, Dark Souls 3 is the most streamlined Dark Souls game, and it takes the best parts of the other games and refines them to a high degree. This can be good or bad depending on what you liked of the originals, as its faster pace of combat might not make it feel like the most traditional Dark Souls, but its quality of life buffs make it more accessible overall. Just like Demon's Souls and Dark Souls 2, Dark Souls 3 goes back to kind of having a hub area where you're able to send your NPCs. This makes it easier to purchase items and complete quests, so it's really nice having that compared to Dark Souls 1 where the world feels a bit more disjointed. However, if you are more of a fan of the Dark Souls 1 style where the world is more disconnected or at least more spread out, that can be a little bit of a downer just because the game does feel more cookie cutter as a result. So one of the quality of life features of Dark Souls 3 is that it doesn't use the same hollowing system in Dark Souls 2. And for those who may be unfamiliar with that, whenever you died in Dark Souls 2 you would lose a bit of your max HP, but that kind of system doesn't return in Dark Souls 3, so it's much smoother for newer players or lower skilled players to go through the game without being doubly punished for dying or their misplays. Of course, since hollowing does not return to the same degree as in Dark Souls 2, it does bring up questions of the lore as to how that all fits into the game, as it's not very obvious and they could have done a better job setting that up, and it is understandable why some people would feel a bit distaste for how it was ultimately implemented into the game. Some of the nicer features of Dark Souls 3 is that it has much better camera controls than Dark Souls 1 and 2. This makes it easier to deal with multiple enemies and cycle between targets. Being able to travel between bonfires at the very beginning of the game is nice, and I also like a lot of what they did with the UI of the game. So for example, if you want to use an item like a Homeward Bone, you can travel directly to Firelink Shrine, which is really nice so that way you don't have to wait through 2 loading screens just to go back to the hub world if you're already out and about. In addition to that, they did do a better job of using cutscenes to incorporate the transitions between storytelling and gameplay, and I think each cutscene does a good job of setting the mood for each scene. As I said earlier, Dark Souls 3 feels the most streamlined partially due to its more linear level design. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, since it allows players to have a more cohesive experience, but for the players who really enjoyed the non-linearity of 1 and 2, Dark Souls 3 can feel a little bit more restrictive as a result. So this is a little difficult to talk about following the wake of my review of Dark Souls 2, but I think Dark Souls 3 does a better job of making the game feel more fair and setting up different interactions between the enemies and environment. So one example of this would be in the High Wall of Lothric. There are some enemies which transform into pus of men, and next to some of these enemies there are corpses that have fire bombs on them. So if you loot those fire bombs, it's a little bit of an environmental hint that fire is effective against pus of men, so that's how you're supposed to deal with them. Although, not everybody's going to pick it up, at least there is that kind of element of gameplay to give you something to deal with some of these threats. Aside from that, compared to Dark Souls 2, which I felt attacked the player in unfair ways from the player's blind spots, when you are attacked in blind spots in Dark Souls 3, I think they do a better job of giving you more audio-visual cues that it's going to happen. So if something is coming up from behind you, you can generally hear it better than in Dark Souls 2, and I think the biggest difference, which is really hard to kind of quantify, is that going through Dark Souls 3, you feel pressured from more enemies spawning and attacking you, but you don't necessarily feel overwhelmed, which is the kind of experience that I had initially playing through Dark Souls 2. So while the levels are more linear and feel more disconnected than in Dark Souls 1, I don't think it's as bad a thing, partially because you're able to warp between the bonfires from the beginning of the game. So I think that gives the developers a little bit more freedom to kind of branch out and have more sprawling levels. However, one negative aspect of this is that they do kind of feel a bit more tunnely in terms of getting you to one goal and not just kind of having multiple branching points to choose from. It kind of all always ties back in together, and that can be seen as a good or a bad thing because there are often a lot of shortcuts to make going through each area more smooth overall, but it also does make it feel more cookie cutter again, which can be good or bad depending on your preferences. Generally, I think this was a better design choice for the game overall, as it's better for newer players or lower skilled players to traverse through the areas, However, it is a bit unfortunate when you look into the cut content and see that the levels were going to be more interconnected in certain places. But since you can warp between bonfires, there really isn't as much a need to backtrack between the areas, so it's not as big a deal that they aren't as interconnected as they could be, even if it is unfortunate. Dark Souls 3 also has some of the most memorable areas of the entire trilogy, and Archdragon Peak is kind of like the pinnacle of incorporating environmental storytelling, hidden secrets, as well as thematics into one area. It's also nice going back to revisit areas that were in previous games like Anor Londo, but this is also a bit of a double-edged sword because it can feel a little bit like overt fan service that we go back to these areas, though they do a good job of incorporating thematic elements as to why we would need to go back, and just kind of the general feel of the degradation of the world that's present throughout Dark Souls 3. So, for those who are more fans of Dark Souls 2's approach of breaking the mold from Dark Souls 1, it can come as a bit of a disappointment that we do return to form in Dark Souls 3. However, if you are more of a fan of the elements of Dark Souls 1, it could also be seen as a positive thing, going back to some of those elements. This kind of encapsulates many of the issues surrounding Dark Souls 3. Because it does a lot of heavy lifting from Dark Souls 1 and 2, it doesn't feel nearly as innovative, which can be a little bit disappointing, but the systems that it does have in the game do feel really polished to a high degree. The primary example of that comes from combat. Now, compared to Dark Souls 1 and 2, the combat in 3 is much faster paced, and some people think the game feels more like Bloodborne than a traditional Souls title. Some of the things that I like about Dark Souls 3 combat is that they included weapon arts into the game. This helps differentiate a lot of the more nondescript weapons from the boss weapons, and it does give them a bit more depth and variety in choosing what you'd like to use. However, one of the things that did not return that I know a lot of people were fans of in Dark Souls 2 is power stancing, so it is a bit unfortunate that you can't dual wield to the kind of same capacity that you could in some of the previous titles. Rolling is much nicer in Dark Souls 3 compared to Dark Souls 2. You don't have to worry about leveling up a certain stat to increase the number of iframes on your rolls, which is very, very welcome. But one of the downsides of Dark Souls 3's rolling system is that it's really hard to enjoy PvP just because players can manage their stamina and roll much more frequently than they could in previous titles. Just like the other Dark Souls games, Dark Souls 3 has a good variety of builds, allowing the players to challenge content in different ways. It's also nice that they brought in the respecking system of Dark Souls 2 back into Dark Souls 3, as it gives players more freedom to choose what build is best for their playstyle, and it makes it so it's not as punishing to level up stats that you don't necessarily need or want. It is a little unfortunate that there is a hard limit on how many times you can respec per New Game Plus cycle. I think they could have done a better job setting that up, but overall it's nice because it does give more weight to the player's choices, and it isn't too terrible to go to a New Game Plus cycle, even though it isn't the most user-friendly, I think. One of the more contentious changes to Dark Souls 3 is that there aren't as many hard limits on how many spells one can cast. Instead, they introduced what's called the FP meter, which kind of works as your magic point meter in most traditional games, and it allows you to cast spells as long as you have the FP required for it. One nice feature of having this kind of FP system is that it does make players decide whether or not they want to invest more heavily in their spells that they can cast or how many times they want to heal. So there is more of an intrinsic risk versus reward with playing a caster compared to a more melee character. Enemy design is really good in Dark Souls 3, and it has some of the most memorable boss fights amongst all of the Soulsborne titles. Generally, there are less gimmicks involved within the combat of Dark Souls 3, and its higher pace of action can make some of these fights feel as though they're more reactive, or you have to have a quicker reaction time to kind of get these experiences down. But generally, the core gameplay loop is still the same amongst all the titles, in that you kind of have to learn the pattern of enemy attacks and learn what you can and cannot punish. And I personally really enjoyed the faster style of melee combat in Dark Souls 3. One small issue I had with Dark Souls 3's combat would be the issue of buffered input commands. So what I mean by that is, let's say you're attacking an enemy and you swing 4 times, and on the 3rd time you realize you don't want to swing for the 4th one because you're about to get punished. So you try to kind of overwrite that with a roll. Sometimes it won't matter and it'll still make you do that 4th swing. So it is a bit of an issue on the player's part, I totally recognize that, but it is a little bit off-putting as a result. Generally, I think Dark Souls 3 has the most polished combat of all of the Soulsborne titles, but its world building and lore leaves a little bit to be desired. And what I mean by that is there are a lot of things that it kind of introduces as new elements of the game, but they lead into so many different directions that don't end up going anywhere that it kind of almost feels a little bit intangible for the most part, or not really relevant to the overall thematic experience of the trilogy, in my opinion. The new stuff isn't bad by any means, but I think we've kind of hit the point where less is more just doesn't go far enough anymore. So things like the Profaned Flame, the Deep, and the Lords of Cinder, while they're all really interesting, they all end up feeling a little bit lacking just because you don't get the kind of closure that you'd want in the final game of a trilogy. In many ways, I feel like Dark Souls 3 has kind of the opposite issues of Dark Souls 2. The core gameplay is really solid, and the overall storytelling is really good in terms of its thematic presentation, but its smaller, finer details really feel lackluster in comparison. Because Dark Souls 3 draws so heavily onto Dark Souls 1 and 2, it does call into question what exactly happened to the souls of the 4 big bosses of Dark Souls 1. How come they don't re-emerge? What happened to Koth? Because in the Japanese version of Yuria's dialogue, she does say that he's dead. So it does bring up a lot of unanswered questions. It doesn't exactly fit into the lore of Dark Souls 1 and 2. So for borrowing so heavily from the other games, you'd imagine that it would either keep with those same elements or it should just break away completely and do its own thing. And it just kind of doesn't do either extremely well. So it kind of sits in this weird purgatory of trying to match the modes of the other games versus being its own thing. So it just kind of got a weird spot in the overall series. So it does kind of have those issues where it feels like it panders to fans at times, but it also doesn't go quite far enough to stand on its own 2 feet in some other regards. I really enjoy a lot of the secret elements of the gameplay, although it's not quite as robust as Dark Souls 2 in some regards. Being able to talk to certain characters out of sequence like the Shrine Handmaiden is really interesting, but a lot of the triggers for the quests are really unintuitive and kind of force players to look at guides if they want to do certain things in certain orders, which I think is a really big design flaw shared in common within all of the games. Of course, quite a lot of the painful parts of trying to figure out NPC quest triggers could have been alleviated with a better save system, but by the time you play Dark Souls 3, you probably already have a good indicator of what to expect. Ironically, this makes it both easier and more difficult to rate the game because it's formulaic and you should have a good idea of what to expect, but it also does have quite a lot of the flaws of the originals. A lot of the flaws of the other games don't really stand out in comparison in Dark Souls 3 just because you already kind of have those expectations going into the game, I think. So if I were to give Dark Souls 3 a rating of 1 to 10 on a bell curve, with 1 being an absolute terrible game that I would pay to not play, 5 being an average, enjoyable game, and 10 being an absolute fantastic game with no flaws and nothing I'd want to change about it at all, I'd give Dark Souls 3 an 8 out of 10. The core gameplay experience of Dark Souls 3 is extremely polished, setting it head and shoulders above Dark Souls 1 and 2, but by the same token, it's a little bit formulaic, which can be seen as a negative thing. Opinions about Dark Souls 3 can vary widely depending on what one liked about Dark Souls 1 or 2, but ultimately, I think Dark Souls 3 gives a much smoother gameplay experience than the previous titles. While I actually prefer the world building and feel of Dark Souls 1 over Dark Souls 3, I think Dark Souls 3 does a better job of giving higher highs for beating each section of the game. I also highly recommend picking up the DLC because it takes everything to the next level, and it has some of the best content FromSoft has ever produced. So that more or less concludes this review. I realize that it might seem a little bit weird that I would give the game an 8 out of 10 since I've been praising it so much, but this is more of a case where its strengths also double as its weaknesses, so it does have some systems which are still a little bit painful to experience, like the Covenant Grind and the item economy, but they aren't as big issues as, I would say, plague Dark Souls 1, for instance. Nonetheless, I do think Dark Souls 3 is a really great game, and I highly recommend it to everybody who hasn't played it yet. What score would you give Dark Souls 3? Let me know in the comment section. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. As always, I'd like to thank my patrons, channel members, viewers, commenters, and subscribers. I appreciate it. Until next time, LastProtagonist out.